Welcome to Leadership Disrupted. Today, we are joined by Larry Julian, best-selling author with decades of experience coaching executives and speaking about a tough topic. Is it possible to be a faith-based business leader when the demands of your business are in conflict with the guidance of your faith? So, welcome, Larry. It's good to see you. Larry and I have known each other for years. I
Yes,
think we're going to do each other the respect of not actually counting those years because you get past 20 and I just don't want to.
that's
I
right.
don't
You just
want to
quit.
think anymore. But um, as I said, Larry is. Let me share one other thing on my screen here. Larry is the best-selling author of the book "God Is My CEO," along with three additional books that came after "God Is My CEO." But I remember when "God Is My CEO" was getting major mainstream media recognition, uh, and primarily because of the controversy around the topic, the challenge around the topic, and I think the essential question you were asking, and you asked it of a variety of business leaders. So you dealt with CEOs, you interviewed CEOs, and you were a great interviewer. You asked great questions, and essentially what you were getting to was the heart of how do you integrate work and faith? How do you integrate business decisions and faith? And it's the easy decisions are easy. It's the hard decisions when suddenly there seems to be a conflict with who you think you are as a human and who you think you're supposed to be as a business leader. And when those two seem to be in conflict, what wins out? Your responsibility, not to overstate it, but your responsibility to your business or your responsibility to your soul and the soul of others. But
That's
and
right.
we'll get into that. We will definitely get into that. But my first question, Larry, is um, the success of God as my CEO. Uh, Not that you weren't expecting it to be successful, but it became a massive worldwide phenomenon, and that had to, I would think, surprise you to some degree. What did
Yes.
you learn from all of the doors that opened from the success of that book, just from the general experience of that book launch? What did you learn?
Yeah. I think for starters, let me take one step back and then I'll share from what I learned from the book itself. First question is that why did I write the book and how did that come about? And it really started with before any consideration of writing a book, I was putting on these leadership discussion groups and here in the Twin Cities. And I found it amazing by the fact that these CEOs would gather, and there would be about 11, 12 CEOs in the room. And for the starters, I wanted to create a safe environment for leaders to speak openly about what was going on. And the big aha moment for me was basically these leaders, they could pray to God on Sunday, but Monday through Friday, they walked into an entirely different culture and really didn't know how to respond to it, both personally, but also in terms of setting, let's say, a direction of the company. What is that general uh, theme or what they want out of a culture? And I thought that leaders were like Charlton Heston, where they had all their act together and leading just boldly. And I found that they're more like Bambi, like deer frozen in the headlights, where they really didn't have an answer in terms of, how do I live my faith in a bottom line world? And so through these discussion groups, I had this aha moment about how do they solve this problem? And that's where I felt inspired to find out and what that looked like. And it eventually became a book.
What were some of the most common pinch points? What some of those most common business scenarios where suddenly they felt like I'm struggling with what do I do?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of times, well, let's put it this way: whether you are an entry level person or you're the CEO of the company, inevitably there's going to be pressure on you to produce. And just thinking from a personal standpoint, in my past life, I was in the hotel business and worked my way up from sales manager to director of sales and marketing. And every step of the way, it was very clear. If you produced, you got a cookie and you moved forward. And in my life, if you didn't, you were fired. And so that was the world in which I lived, and which obviously created a lot of tension because it was all about produce or else. And I found that to be the same thing with leaders. No matter what, you are in a position to produce results. That's what business is about. And when you start to think about, serving others, serving your customers, it's easier said than done. It's nice to put on a plaque, but to deliver that is a challenge. And that's where the whole insight regarding the potential of writing a book about how do you just deal with this dilemma where you want to honor your faith, honor others, but how do you do that in a bottom line world?
I think what I was most struck by when we first met over 20 years ago, and we were talking about these kinds of topics, there was no, and still today is no single right answer for every situation. Every set of layoffs is different. Every set of financial stress is different. And so what I loved about your approach is you didn't just give simplistic responses or simplistic answers. I mean, you really understand that when a business leader has obligations to the business, those are real obligations. Those are you can't just say, well, I'm going to do right by my people and
Right.
ignore my shareholders or ignore my community or ignore my investors. So in fact, you have these natural tensions that every business leader faces. And like you just said, they get bigger as you get more cookies.
That's right.
It's great, you get more cookies, but you also, cookies get processed and digested, and then you need more cookies, and there's more pressure to
That's
keep
right.
getting more cookies for sure. Um, so what was it? What was it like in terms of suddenly now you go from facilitating these small groups within the Twin Cities of business leaders, having these kinds of dialogue and discussions, um, and then suddenly you are not just a national phenomenon, you are a global phenomenon. What was that like?
Thank you. Well, you're too kind, and but it was different for sure in terms of having the opportunity when you write a book, and then after writing the book, you're obligated to market the book, and so that was a lot of radio interviews and television interviews, and that was very different for me. Never really had done that. But one thing that at least struck with the I don't know, the world, if you would, they recognized the challenges that we all face, whether you're a line employee or the CEO. There's always a pressure on you, and the other part to that is timing. In other words, it takes time to build a good company. It takes time to build an individual to grow, but really in the business world, they don't allow the time. It's always for the next. For me, at least, it was always the next month. We had to produce X amount in the next month, the next quarter, and unfortunately, we were then faced with this concept of short-term delivery versus long-term growth. And in the business world, for the most part, not all companies, I think that they are so focused on just needing to produce in the immediate, they never really establish a long-term vision and mission that really helps a company grow as well as increase customer value. It was always a short-term treadmill.
And yet, almost every organization has their mission statement, their values statement. In almost none of them, in fact, maybe let's say in none of them is, hey, our highest value is the next quarter. So they never actually say it overtly.
That's
Hey,
right.
our mission is to exceed investor expectations
Right.
for the next 90 days.
Right.
Instead, the mission statements are high-minded.
Mm.
So in many ways, the tension between faith and business leadership is also the tension between mission and business
That's
leadership,
correct.
and making that mission a reality. Um, one of the things I was struck by as we were discussing, I mean, you never really shared intimate details with me about specific leaders, but you told me stories, and I was struck by how open they were to you. And maybe that came from
Yeah, that's a good point.
the fact that you had a shared faith with them, the fact that you had a trust that was built up with them. So they were willing to open up and share their inner lives, and
Right.
share their inner challenges. Um, what what struck you about those inner lives? Anything that was different than what you might have expected as just a viewer from the outside?
Yeah, I think first of all, my perspective when I started interviewing these leaders, that I kind of put them up on a pedestal. If you're the CEO of a company, and um, I had a perception of what that CEO is like. And when I realized, when I started to have interviews, that it was so different, and one individual, I mean, there were several individuals that uh, really kind of transformed my thinking about leaders, or leadership. But probably the one that struck me the most, that was interesting, was a gentleman named Truett Cathy, who was the founder of Chick-fil-A. And my perception, well, if you're the founder of a huge company, you're a business guy. And when I met him, he was grandpa. He he didn't actually, at this stage in his life, his son had taken over the company. He was kind of more of a figurehead, but he had these very simple Southern values, and it struck me how those values is what created the company, and a huge company at that. And that was really when it hit home to me, that sometimes it's the simplest core values that really make a company successful. And yes, you need to have smarts and develop strategic plans and do all those things. But I think one of the lessons learned is if starting at core values really helps you develop a good organization, and it's a guideline and a guidepost for developing good people, not just hiring good people, but developing good people. And so I was very impressed with that.
Part of what I take away from that as well is that the senior leaders, once they're in that C-suite, in that executive area, they might dress differently. They might even, use slightly different vocabulary. They might drive a nicer car, live in a nicer home, but who they are at their core as humans hasn't really changed, or in most cases hasn't not really changed.
Right.
And so they bring with them both the strengths and the downsides of that humanity that was built as they were growing up in the business. But that's easy to forget. It's easy to not see that, because if I'm a new employee and all my whole experience is the elevator door opens and the CEO steps in, and for 5 floors I have to be with this man or woman, it can be pretty overwhelming and intimidating, and forget that, well, actually this is just another human being who happens to
Right.
be here, and have a nice normal chat or conversation. Um, any other experiences with senior leaders, or leaders of note, where who they were or how they were surprised you?
Um, Yeah, I think that, well, one person that surprised me, maybe it's my own perception, a gentleman named Tony Dungy, he's well known. He as a head coach in the NFL, and it was for Tampa Bay Buccaneers and other organizations. But what I liked about him is he had a style, a leadership style that was simply, how would I put it, sort of like, uh, he's not the rah rah guy, and he is not a dominating, person, like, getting in your face. And I sometimes I equate football with the corporate world, where it's very macho. It's all about producing results. It's all about wins and losses. And
Well, in the world of professional sports, you're dealing with high energy, high power players, lots of intensity, lots of energy, lots of passion. And I think we've all seen the Phil Knights of the world who bring that same intensity and passion to their coaching style. But what I hear you saying is Tony Dungy was the exact opposite of that.
exact right. And I appreciated that because I'm low key in the way that I approach things. So it's not that, in your face. And I think that it works. It works in terms of if you're really open and people trust you, that you can develop in your own pace without this pressure of producing immediately. And growth is a strong piece of that, allowing people to grow stronger and better, and that's a good thing.
So I think leaders today, and I have the opportunity to talk to business leaders at every level, early stage, emerging leaders, mid-career leaders, senior executives. Um, and I do think today there is a crisis of faith. There is a struggle they might not think of it in those terms of those specific words, but over and over again, I do hear leaders saying, I'm not sure who they need me to be, who they need to show up today. Our business has changed, our world has changed. It has become so much more complicated, in many ways, so much more secular, and yet you have leaders who have deep internal faith, but they have organizations that are widely diverse, and not just diverse in terms of race, gender, sexuality, but all the diversities, neurodiversity, family diversity, education diversity, economic diversity, even diversity of thought and personality and behavioral styles. And when you open your eyes to look at how diverse your workforce
Right.
is, it can be a little overwhelming. It can feel a little like I don't know what I need to do. And so then you kind of fall back into your old patterns because that's safe for you. But what we know is the old patterns aren't really safe. So uh, when leaders are under tension, under stress, um, is there any guidance that occurs to you that might help a leader recenter, return to or go back to who they are, and then work themselves out from there again? Because in many of our conversations, as you were talking through either your process or another faith-based leader's process, over and over again, what I heard was, I I experienced something in the workplace where there's a natural tension between who I am as a person of faith and what the business seems to require of me. So then let me go back to my core, remind myself of my core, and then work my way out through that and actually have to think my way through it, because it's not like I can go and a particular passage in the Bible or a particular thought is going to say, aha, oh, there's the answer. It's more of I have to find the answer, but I can work my way through that. But anything you can share regarding a thought process that any leader can use to recenter themselves?
Yeah, I think that first of all, we're all human, and so we all have our strengths and our weaknesses. And I think that one way or another, I think that it's a wonderful thing to have where you are accepting yourself on who you are, and also the ability to accept others on who they are. At the same time, if you are a leader and a leader of business, there's always some kind of tension that whether it's a written rule or unwritten rule, you're there to produce. And so, being just bottom line about this, there are times where you could be the greatest person in the world, but if for whatever reason you're not producing, you may be fired or whatever that happens from that. I think that what's important is for each individual is that being open to learning, number one, and changing. And at least for me, from a personal standpoint, from a faith perspective, we're all human. And the first thing that comes to our mind is, well, it's, how do I help me? And how do I, how do I get better? And those kinds of things. And I think one of the things I learned from faith is, in my Christian faith is really, how do you serve others? And so what does that look like? And I think part of the process for a lot of people, which I admit that I've been self-serving for my entire life, but when I grew in my faith, it changed the paradigm towards how do I help or serve others? And so in that paradigm, it enables you to grow as a better person, to be a better service to others. And so sometimes it's not a corporate program, but it's individuals learning and growing. And as they grow and mature, whether it's maturing in faith or just your character, you become a better, better employee, better person, better leader, because you're looking at growing. And by the natural process of you growing, you're helping others grow themselves, and especially by leader by example, because people will see who you are and want to emulate that.
I know a lot of leaders in their early years, they go through a lot of growth. They are young, they don't know a lot, they're learning, they're making mistakes. They probably do more things right than wrong. That's how they grow and how their career trajectory rises. But there does seem to be a point where their progress starts to create confidence, and then that confidence helps.
That's right.
But then that confidence, when it becomes too strong, they reach the C-suite, or they reach a pinnacle, perhaps even farther than they had ever expected to get to. Then suddenly that old humility becomes difficult, where it's hard for them to strip themselves back down to say, okay, I don't know it all, and the world has changed, and maybe I'm not all that. And I think sometimes faith can be a pathway back to humility. Because if you don't reflect deeply, genuinely, you're not going to grow. Does that prompt any thoughts?
It does. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think humility has to be one of the key points of not just leadership, but of life. I think that at the very core, us humans are self-centered. Well, I'll just start with myself. I've been self-centered my entire life, and I still am to this day. And so, step number one is just admitting that. And if you think about it, the whole concept of humility, it sounds great, and it is great, having humility. And there are a lot of really good points about really significant growth through humility. But I know this sounds kind of odd, but there are times where it's not about having humility. I've been humbled. And even at the time, I didn't really like that. But I think that they have been the greatest learning points in my life. And sometimes it's like having a kid where they eventually just need a timeout because they just get all worked up, and you have to just put them in a timeout. I think that God puts us in a timeout from time to time, and the Lord humbles us. And so it's a process of getting better as a human, and where you then have the opportunity to be a better leader. And you don't look to be humbled. but sometimes you just are. And I think it's probably one of the most important processes we could ever go through. We wouldn't do it on our own. Sometimes it just happens to us.
Well, and I was thinking as we were scheduling this podcast, I was thinking back to our more than 2 decades of spending time together, becoming friends. Somehow, I mean, I read God is My CEO way back when, and then I've read each of your subsequent books, and even though these are books written by a deeply faith-based author about faith-based leadership, I mean, as you know, I am more of a secular heathen, and I read those books, and they still tap into something. They still there's something there for me, and I think for a lot of other people as well. Obviously, because of the success of the books, and that return to humility, I think, is part of the core of the value where it forces you to pull back and go deep, because we spend so much of our time face forward, fighting the business battle, solving those problems. Um, we develop our critical thinking skills and our strategic thinking skills and our systems thinking skills, and then suddenly an issue comes up, a big problem, and we think we're going to apply all of those things, and then it's not working the way it used to or the way we thought that it should. So like you said, God humbles us, the universe humbles us, something, our shareholders humble us, something
Right.
something humbles us. And if we fight that, if we take that situation and we fight back with the same level of thinking, it's probably just going to spiral downwards. And
Right.
sometimes there is value in taking a breath, stepping back, going internal, and then asking yourself the deeper questions about why is this happening? Where's the value in this for me? How do you? And I know you do a lot of individual one-on-one coaching. You have done a lot of small group coaching. How do you guide um, leaders back to that place of humility, back to that place of self-reflection?
Right. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is spending a lot of time developing challenging and thought-provoking questions. And I think questions are fantastic because um, it makes you think, right there, just makes you think, versus with arrogance, sometimes you know it all. And you don't have the desire to think, well, not just think beyond the box, but think beyond your own, how would I say it, ego, self-serving ego. And that's where the sometimes the best thing that happens is to be humbled, because when you've been flattened, it does make you think. I would say gives you time for pause, going, I wonder, there must be another way. And it's hard to do on our own because we just get caught up in whatever. And whether it's ego or fear, which is a both keep us from growing. Sometimes or I'd say not just sometimes, but ideally, sometimes you need to be put in your place, so to speak, and be humbled. And that's a great place to be because you are very open to learning after that. So,
But also very uncomfortable for senior leaders because they haven't
right,
been in that place in a long time.
right,
Um, you talk about asking thought-provoking questions. When one of my favorite questions, after I've asked myself something like a typical business question, what's the root cause? What's really going on here? What are the dynamics underneath? Like, what's the issue under the issue? Asking the questions that might cause some analysis, and then my mind comes up with answers. But then my favorite question is, do you really know what you think you know? So you have an answer,
right,
okay, but do you really know that? And then following that up with, how do you know? Like, like testing your own thinking, thinking about your own thinking, because I I do know a lot of times we're so used to coming up with answers, we're so used to being confident in our answers, that if we don't take a moment I had a leader a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the culture of her organization. And I had asked, like, how would you describe the culture of your organization? And she described it. And I said to her, so how do you know that? What's your evidence? And she first of all, she referenced their mission statement and a few other kind of surfacey things, and then a few other things that were kind of light and shallow. And I said, okay, so that is one set of information. But how do you know? Like, how do you know that's the culture day in and day out? When someone comes in the morning, is that the culture they experience? And I said to her, I'm not saying you don't know. I'm just wondering how do you know? And as we as that conversation progressed, she said, honestly, I guess I'm making assumptions. I'm making assumptions because this is what I've communicated to my direct reports. This is what I've communicated via videos and emails. So what I've said is we're about this, but I don't know if that's what we're about. I'm not tapped in enough. And I contrast that with some leaders, I think it's the 70s, there was a phrase, management by walking around. One of the benefits of that approach was you really get a strong sense of what the actual culture is by walking around, wandering through the front lines of the business, talking to the people at every level of the business, observing people at every level of the business. But again, for at least this leader I was talking to, it wasn't until that moment of humility where because up until that point, she was just assuming, I know what our culture is. I know what I say. I know what I do. Ergo, that must be the culture because that's what I'm communicating. And that moment of humility opened her up to other possibilities. And I know that she is now taking some time and action to gain a more accurate sense of what the actual culture is. Oh, and I remember what prompted it. What prompted it is she was perplexed by the results of the annual employee engagement survey. So we got into this conversation because she was looking at these results, and she was struggling with, well, how this is not who we are. How can people be this disengaged when this is what we are? And then we got to the question of, how do you know what you are? Where does that come from? When you've done some work with emerging leaders, and is there anything unique about those individuals who they're just starting out? They
Right.
haven't faced a lot of these trials.
Correct. Yeah, that's good.
What's it like doing coaching for emerging leaders?
Yeah. It is different because I think what you said is true. Sometimes, well, first of all, for emerging leaders, and oftentimes they are younger, and they're a lot of them are very talented, but they also, which is a good thing, have a good sense of self, which is a good thing. But one of the things that I find interesting is, I won't say all, but most people starting out in business or younger leaders, they want to grow and rise, if you would, whether within a company or wanting to be successful. And I can tell you, I mean, one question that I think is a very interesting question is, how do you define success? Well, what does success look like for you? And so it could go a very wide range of that. But oftentimes, success relates to success in a career, success in making money, those kinds of things. And probably, and I don't know, I really can't speak to all of this, but from a big picture, what does success look like in terms of, personal, professional, just spiritual? What does that look like? And I think that one of the things that I've learned now, looking back on my life, it was really those times of defeat that really were the defining moments of my life, and they were so necessary because they humbled me, and it when you're humbled, you're open to thoughts and suggestions. You're finally humbled to the point of, okay, I'm listening, where before you're really not. And I think it's one of the most important things there is, because humility really will be the foundation of which, and again, this is from a spiritual standpoint. When people start talking about calling, what is your calling? Um, there is a sense of calling that's unique to each of us based on our talents and life circumstances. And I think that becomes an important thing. But the very first foundation is this humility to be open to hearing, let's say, God's call on your life. And that sounds rather nebulous and out there, but part of that is starting to make bold choices and what that looks like. How do you recover from a very difficult defeat? All of those things are really your stepping stones to where God is leading you. It's not this happy-go-lucky life that you're in charge of. I think there's so much beyond your control, and that's one of the great things to learn, is that you have very little control. You think that you do, but you really don't. There's too much stuff out there.
I hate to admit it, but when I go back to my mid-20s and I was leading a small team, if someone had asked me, and if I'd been willing to be honest with them at that time, if someone had asked me what drives you, what are your goals, what are you all about? I mean, I know what I was all about, because I remember I had a vision board, and my vision board was filled with stuff.
Right.
There was a very nice bright red sports car. I had a particular house in a particular area of San Diego that I wanted. I had a lot of things that I wanted, and all of those were supposed to represent some kind of success for me. And when I look back on it now, it was so shallow, and also hard to achieve. I mean, ultimately, I wasn't successful with that kind of vision board because I had things on there that were not fully within my control. Whereas if I was giving advice to an emerging leader today, certainly I would say, yeah, have some tangible goals,
Right.
some tangible things that will drive you, but think a little more deeply about who do you want to be as a leader? What do you want to stand for as a leader? In my own secular way, I would be asking the same questions, which is, what do you want to stand for? What do you want your legacy to be? Start thinking about legacy now, not in 30 years. Think about legacy today, because your legacy starts today. And you can have a 30, 40-year legacy, but then it does require you to think more humbly, think more deeply. And that doesn't come to us naturally today.
No, it isn't.
Maybe it didn't back then either, but it definitely does not today. In an era of social media, where if I open up LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram, any of those, TikTok, I'm not being flooded with people telling me to think deeply and humbly about what I want to stand for. I'm being flooded with Bugattis, $600 million yachts, jet planes, people who weigh 85 pounds. I mean, there's an entire world within social media that doesn't actually reflect reality. But if I'm not conscious of my center, my core, my faith, and what's driving me, you can really get pulled into that, and it can affect not only my own mindset as a leader, but I think leaders have to be more sensitive to the fact that it is affecting all of their employees. Everyone is swimming in these waters, so everyone's mindset is being shifted and changed, and it's hard to grab hold of that deeper thinking from them. I don't have any particular solution, but I'm really intrigued right now about the concept of searching inward. I think that if nothing else from this podcast, if leaders of faith and secular leaders like myself can hit the pause button a bit and cause us to think a little more deeply. And I would strongly, absolutely recommend God is My CEO to any business leader. And no matter what your faith journey might be, no matter what your specific faith might be, it's a really powerful book because you're primarily interviewing other CEOs and asking them thought-provoking questions. I mean, that's the essence of the book.
If I was to write a book, which I'm not going to, if I was, what came to my mind is I would put the title as "Failing My Way to the Top," and of course, there's a little bit of humor with that. But now, at the ripe old age of 71 years old, and looking back on my life and saying, I remember doing this exercise, and so I'm at my desk, and yes, here I am at 71, and I look back on when I started my career at 21, so 50 plus years, and basically ask the question, how did I get from there at 21 to being here at 71? And so it was an interesting question, and basically that the first word that came to my mind was failure. Um, and I was jokingly, thinking, wow, this would be a great book about failing my way to the top. And what I like about failure is that it definitely humbles us. And you can't, I mean, on my own, it was very difficult to be humble, but it was very interesting when I was humbled. I was very open. It was the most open to hearing God's voice on what he wanted, he wanted me to go, but as well as being humbled to take a really honest look at yourself and, both from, strengths and weaknesses, what are the things that I do well, or what is my unique giftedness, but also what were the things that, have kind of been my downfall, my own ego, and definitely, with the whole concept of ego and humility, ego is a good thing because it's a strong sense of self, which is very good. And it helps you, quote, grow. But at the same time, humility is what really gets at the heart of who you really are. And also this, at least from my standpoint, from a standpoint of faith, is, what is God's call on my life? And so what does that look like? And so anyway, so I would like to say that those concepts have really got me to where I am today, from past to the present. And I keep on harping on this thing of failure, but I really do think that failure is an important aspect to having success.
Reframing that can be hugely powerful. I can absolutely attest to that. I do want to say, Larry, as we're wrapping up, I appreciate this, and I'm gonna just share your books one more time briefly, because I would highly recommend them, particularly the first one, God is My CEO, to any business leader, just as a way of prompting that inner journey and prompting to reflect on your own experience through the experience of other CEOs, other faith-based business leaders. And so, wrapping up, let me just say, first of all, thank you. This is fantastic. I really appreciate you spending the time. Maybe we'll get a chance to do this again at some point in the future. And I will leave it at that. And again, everyone, Larry Julian, best-selling author, God is My CEO. Thank you so much for your time, Larry.
All right. Thank you. It was great. Thank you very much.